Right, hey guys. So on the other side of this screen here, I have none other than the Dr. Eric Helms. And rumor on the street has it that you are obsessed with pyramids. Would you mind
I mean,
clarifying that obsession for the people? Because there's been some concerns about Illuminati association. What is Freedom Muscle Journey really? Would you mind
mhm.
just explaining?
So I think there's a number of things that are happening right now. So for one, I'm in a continuing legal battle with Egypt regarding who really had the first pyramids, and we'll see how that resolves. Secondly, the Illuminati is definitely something I'm part of, which is the secret cabal of natural bodybuilders who are taking over the fitness industry. Unfortunately, we have had a claim against us for copyright infringement by the Illuminati. Sorry, the Illuminati, the secret organization that is vying for control of the world, maybe with or in competition with reptilian overlords. So right now, it's a stressful time for me. It is a time of reflection, though, as well. It speaks to, I think some of the things I've accomplished, that I'm essentially at a crossroads where I have to decide, do I want to battle with the Illuminati, excuse me, or Egypt? You don't want to have a war on two fronts, but I'm playing with the big boys and girls now. So, you can't I got to stay grateful, that I'm at this point in my career.
Well, hopefully, that clears some things up for the viewers. Basically, it's complicated and it's ongoing,
Mm,
and only time will really tell. And with the current zombie apocalypse, we may never know. So
absolutely.
it's unfortunate, but just
History will be written by the victors, and at this stage, that may just be,
it's gonna be Eric.
uh, yeah, exactly. There you go. So, yeah.
There's only there. We only see one. You know, Nobody really wants to say it because of legal issues, but
Mm.
I think we all know how it'll turn out. Um, but anyways, the the main topic I wanted that this episode is going to delve into is basically programming differences for bodybuilders. People who are physique enthusiasts who are in search of the hypertrophies, or people
Mm.
that really like the idea of picking up really heavy rocks in the form of barbells
Mm.
and whatnot. So barbell based movements for powerlifting. And Dr. Helms has experience competing in both sports, interestingly, and has extensive coaching experience. Um, he's coached Bryce Lewis and multiple natural bodybuilders to the stage. So he has lots of practical experience, not only anecdotally, but also practically in the field. Um, so I guess to begin, I would like to just first ask, what are the main differences that you have to consider when you have a client who, let's say, you have a client that comes to you, and in the case of Bryce, a power lifter. What are the main considerations that you would take into account when constructing a strength-based program?
Yeah. So if I'm going to be writing a program for a power lifter, I need to know, and this is a philosophy that extends to any client, where they are currently, where they've been, and where they need to go. So I'm coming in at a time point in their career, but they've been around doing this thing for a while. And even if they are completely new to the idea of powerlifting or wanting to train for powerlifting, they probably have some training history, or they at least have a personal history, which can give me better information about how to help them. So the best way to determine what's an appropriate, volume for a power lifter, or loading, or frequency of the lifts. And this has parallels with any other client, like the size of the calorie deficit for someone who's dieting, the one who's training for anything. All comes down to where have they been, and what do they have access to? What are they currently doing? What's been successful in the past, or at the very least, what has not been successful in the past? Um, and then you apply that same framework to whatever the goal is. So for a power lifter, There are very few like absolute givens, but there are some. Um, they are going to need to do the squat, the bench, and the deadlift, and they're going to need to try to get the highest single rep they can on the platform. So we have some guidelines for specificity there. It means you're probably going to want them doing the squat, bench, and deadlift, and they're going to need to be training heavy. And beyond that, man, there's a ton of variation you can have. There's a ton of inter-individual differences that will guide those things. And those inter-individual differences are not just necessarily like physiological or genetic, because it's not like I get a genetic test for all my athletes done, nor even if I did, would I know what to do with it. However, what type of life they have. Do they train at home? Do they have a gym they train at? Do they train after a long day at work? Do they train first thing in the morning before they go to work? Are they someone who's a trainer and they have much more flexible hours with their training? Are they someone who has been training for a long time but is new to powerlifting? There's almost an endless number of questions. So all of that kind of is applied to those two basic principles. We need to lift heavy. We need to do the big three to dictate that program. Beyond that, then there becomes the question of when do you plan to compete, if you plan to compete. Since you kind of frame this as powerlifters and bodybuilders, well, I think it's useful to take the idea of competition, because the more constraints and timeframes you have to work with, the more the plan starts to fall into place. So if someone comes to me with 6 weeks to prepare for a powerlifting competition, I know it's going to be highly specific. We're going to be doing a lot of the competition lifts in a traditional format, and we're going to be trying to push as much intensity through that system as we can without breaking the person to get them prepared to compete on game day. If they come to me 6 months out, then I will have a good chunk of time to lay down some of the long-term aspects that might contribute to strength. So trying to see if we can grow some muscle, trying to see if we can and build a lot of the habits around what might benefit their strength long-term. So looking at what can we do with qualitative aspects of the diet, what can we do to non-energetic factors like when you eat, how you distribute your nutrients, which food are you get enough fruits and vegetables, all this stuff. What is your sleep like? So I think when I have more time with someone, I can look outside of the most specific factors. And when I have less time, it has to be highly specific, but still related to what they've been doing. So, a lot of what we call quote unquote periodization and some of the concepts for strength are pretty logical when you think about them. So for example, we know that strength has a lot of things that factor into it. Your technical execution. You can take someone who is not very good at squatting, benching, or deadlifting and teach them to be more efficient. And they can, within a couple of days, increase their strength once they kind of ingrain those motor patterns. Likewise, you can take someone who's a very efficient conventional deadlifter and a very efficient sumo deadlifter, and one will probably be higher. And that just might be certain characteristics of their body that lend them to one or another. So you might have to experiment to figure out what that is. Motivational factors, arousal, and a lot of acute things might affect strength, but also how much muscle mass do you have? And what are the other morphological adaptations to strength training that can give you, greater strength output, like better lateral force transmission and neuromuscular adaptations. There's a bunch of stuff, but going back to that question of periodization, if I have enough time, I can do more of those longer term adaptations. So I can put them through a higher volume block. I can use less specific training, because while a deadlift does train your lats, because you have to do some shoulder extension to keep the bar close to your body, no one would argue that the deadlift is the best lat builder out there. Likewise, a arched, wide grip, limited range of motion bench press is definitely going to build your chest, but most people wouldn't suggest that it's a really fantastic pec builder. It's a great way to express your maximal bench press strength within the confines of the sport. So perhaps, we would be doing things like more rowing, doing lat pull downs, etc., and then also doing different types of chest work, flat back, medium grip bench, dumbbells, incline, etc., etc. Likewise, while the squat, the bench, and the deadlift are the best way to build the strength in the squat, the bench, and the deadlift in the immediate term, they might also, especially at high loads, have have the highest risks for potential injury or pain. If you look at risk factors, rates of injuries per 1,000 hours of training, they're about 2 to 3 to 4 times higher in powerlifters and bodybuilders. Is that because of the heavy loads? Is that because they have to do squat, bench, and deadlift? Probably a little bit of both. So if I can achieve hypertrophy and other adaptations that are beneficial in the long run to strength without forcing them to lift heavy and do the big three, that's probably a safer bet. And I need time to do that, because I'm not going to have them doing sets of 8 on dumbbell presses when they're 4 weeks out, because that opportunity cost could be something that could be spent on something more specific and is more likely to translate to the platform. So the periodization becomes a little more clear for a strength athlete, where you go through phases of higher reps, higher volumes, less specific work on a continuum until you're getting very close to the competition and you're doing singles near your competition lifts, whether that's close to the opener or occasionally really pushing the limit with a spotter to see what you can do before we then taper, drop some of that fatigue, dissipate some of any pain and just stress levels that are mental, and then come into the competition ready to perform. All of that lays out very nicely for a power lifter once you know what their schedule is. So those are kind of the big factor considerations. And there's so many inter-individual differences that will dictate whether you're squatting 5 times a week or whether you're squatting once and then doing only squatting twice per week, depending on age, family life, all the other things I mentioned earlier.
Awesome. Well, that unpacked a lot of things. So I guess going off of the more of the powerlifting direction, in terms of, you mentioned how you would kind of do, and more or less for anybody who is a strength coach or who does prep, sport athletes such as, a football player or baseball player, what kind of, Eric, that you just outlined a general preparatory period, a more specific period, and then like once you're actually in the competition season, which in the case of a power lifter would be when you're peaking for the meet to express maximal forces, the most specific movements and whatnot to actually be the best on the platform on that one day, because that's the whole purpose of peaking, is to be the strongest on that one day. It doesn't matter if you're strong 3 weeks out, because that's not a competition. So I guess when you are planning, I guess, let's say, let's just look at in general getting, and let's bias this more towards an intermediate lifter, a late beginner, early intermediate. Let's say that you have 6 months in between a competition and you have 6 months to get ready. And I think that with powerlifting, there are many different ways that people will prefer to program. You have some coaches that insist on doing heavy singles, undulating not just load, across a microcycle, but also specific rep ranges, and the same week you could be doing, a single and then, back down sets of 7 and then do sets of 5. And you have other coaches, more of like how I personally do it is more in terms of specific blocks of periods, devoted to mostly hypertrophy, less specific work, a strength block, and then a peaking block. And I guess I wanted to ask, I guess, how much do we actually know of, is there like a best way to program for strength indefinitely based off of current data? Because this is something that I've been questioning myself with my own programming, because you see success with a lot of different pathways, and this could be due to inter-individual differences or whatever, but in terms of your practical experience, what the data currently does say, using an evidence-based fitness approach, true to its form, what have you found to be the best approach, or is likely, or can you even say definitively that there is likely a best approach for a powerlifter who's 6 months out, in terms of how should their programming look?
Good question. I like that you want to use an evidence-based framework, because it allows us to speak to experience, the needs of the individual, and also the data. And for those who are listening, those are kind of the three stool legs to what evidence-based practice is. So from that experience, the beauty of anecdotes is they provide information differently than research. Research is typically telling you about group averages, and it has known limitations. Probably the most pertinent limitation in this case is that the average training study, I wouldn't even say average, the majority of training studies are about 8 weeks long. Some are 12, and those are often framed as long-term training studies. And then the occasional one is longer than that. We're talking about a 6-month period. That's 26 weeks or something like that. And so that means that the long-term quote unquote training studies are less than half the length we're talking about. So that really limits what we can take from the data, as telling us kind of like, hey, what are like the 1 to 2 mesocycle, maybe 1 to 3 mesocycle length adaptations we can expect when comparing different paradigms. Another limitation is that comparing different paradigms is something you should probably put quotes around. If you were to run a study where you compared a daily undulating model to a linear model or a block model, unless someone has done what I would say is the impossible job of making one of those models of periodization representative of all models or programs that could come from those periodization approaches, we can really only say with confidence that those differences were specific to those iterations. So what can we say purely from the literature, which isn't something that would be evidence-based? That would be like science, like purist-based, which isn't a good idea, is that you should probably have some linearity. By linearity, I mean starting with higher volumes and lower loads and getting to higher loads and lower volumes and tapering seems to reliably improve strength more than just having a static approach. And in general, that's kind of some of the relationships I talked about between hypertrophy and strength, maybe even getting more practice at lower loads before you become more specific later on. And generally also the idea of dumping fatigue at the end, the taper. So that's kind of like the purest approach there. And if we were to use just a pure super science-based program, that would mean, okay, we're going to start with squat, bench, deadlift, a couple of accessories, and we're going to do 8s, and then we're going to do 6s, and then we're going to do 4s, and we're going to do 2s, we're going to take a couple of days off, drop a set off, and then we're going to compete, and there's modifications to that, but that would be hashtag science-based. Anecdotes are interesting because they are our own pattern recognition, and an expert is defined as someone who can make complex decisions without necessarily knowing what led to it and be right more than someone who's a non-expert. So this is essentially what intuition is. So there's been research on intuition, and the more complex the task, the more false experts there are with faulty intuition, So great book by Daniel Kahneman called Thinking Fast and Slow. He goes over some research where people who try to play the markets, investors, people who play the stock markets, they think they have expertise, but when actually objectively looking at their stats, they're not doing better than chance because the stock market is an incredibly complex system. However, firemen, highly experienced firemen, may be able to remove their team from a burning building before it collapses, and they won't be able to tell you what they specifically saw that told them that building was going to collapse. And the difference is that they're operating over different time scales and different complexities. So that fireman is dealing with immediate connections between patterns of structural integrity of a home that he's been in, multiple times per day on every shift he's ran. Knows that he knows how hot it feels. He knows the kind of weight that's on the ground, how long the fire's been burning, other homes in this area. There's a bunch of data points that is reliably given that firefighter the skill he has, and there's other examples beyond firefighters that I could come up with. While the stock investor is creating probably just as many false correlations that are not causative or not related as there are, negative ones or positive ones, I should say, or real ones. And there's, regression to the mean, negativity or positivity biases. and all kinds of things that are going on there, rationalizing, looking backwards to making sure things make sense. So for a coach to develop a pretty good quote unquote intuition and to become an expert, you have to have taken a lot of athletes from the start to the finish, and probably what I would argue is beyond the novice phase. So there's a term called regression to the mean. And regression to the mean is the idea that because humans are homeostatic biological systems, they will move towards homeostasis. Okay, that is the mean. So they will regress towards normal. So this is especially important in medical literature. Like if this is why they give placebo drugs to people, because people typically get better unless they've been diagnosed with some kind of fast-acting fatal disease. Like if you take two people with a cold and you do nothing with one person and you give the other person vitamin C, that shows the importance of the regression to the mean, because people typically get better from colds. And if someone started having a cold, started taking vitamin C and got better, it's easy to confuse vitamin C as curing their cold with regression to the mean, when it's probably the latter. But the only way you can know is comparing a placebo control group and also having that vitamin C group. And then you can see the effectiveness of expectation, that's placebo, regression to the mean, the control group, and then also vitamin C in above whatever that placebo might do. So this is a complex discussion of how scientific theory works, but how it applies to resistance training is interesting. Novices, and this has been quoted many times before and shown pretty well in the research, doing fitness of any type tends to just improve their fitness overall. Once we start getting to the point where someone is competing in powerlifting, a late stage novice or an intermediate, like you said, they're not going to regress to being advanced or an intermediate, right? So just by doing crappy training, most powerlifters will plateau based on whatever is kind of like a low stage intermediate for their genetics. So that means the experience of working with a swath of competitors and seeing them improve, that is how an expert develops their expertise, seeing those relationships. And importantly, not just firing anyone who doesn't do well and blaming on them for lack of adherence, but actually assessing failures and successes and kind of revising your plan, going back to the so-called drawing board.
Going off of that, actually, sorry to interrupt, but I think that's something that's really, really important, because sometimes we can become so grounded in, oh, this one thing worked, or like, oh, well, if somebody can't follow your plan, and like obviously like you're gonna have like one person here or there that may not be able to follow like the plan, but countless other athletes. But like what you said with regression towards the mean, if lots of people are unable to sustain that, such as with a Bulgarian method for a prolonged period of time, it's probably not the best long-term approach and isn't going to produce the best outcomes. So I just wanted to put that out there.
Oh, well said. Yeah, absolutely. And I think, yeah, the Bulgarian method or some of the Eastern European approaches or some of that sport system is very interesting, because when you have a high population of people who can go into a very challenging standardized system, and if we know that only a small percentage of them make it through, and then only a small percentage of the people who make it through become elite, all we can say is that program only works for the people it worked for, which is a very obvious statement. It's not very helpful. So that kind of dovetails nicely into, okay, then what can we learn from anecdote? We know, like there's a saying, success leaves clues. And if we've kind of controlled for this regression to the mean thing, success at the highest levels in sports science is something, or rather in sport, is something that sports scientists pay attention to, because we know at the very highest level that there's few things that discriminate between athletes. If you're going to win at a certain level, that means everybody has these certain prerequisites to get to that spot. So maybe there is something to success, but I think it's important to know what those clues are. And if you have been a coach who has successfully taken a broad population of athletes to improving their totals past the novice stage, that means you're doing more right than wrong. Doesn't mean you're not doing wrong, doesn't mean you're doing the best. But success leave clues basically says, what I've done hasn't prevented improvement. So we know that you're not wrong. We don't know that you're right. So I think that is the limits of anecdotes, while the limits of science is kind of that generalizability. And it gives you a very fuzzy picture of what you should be doing. And then you can kind of, like it's a relay race, that the science then passes the baton onto your anecdotal experience. And then you can try to be like, all right, so I've got the big rocks in place. This individual seems to have these specific responses, or they remind me of this other person that was like them. Like, oh, who was built just like you? And when I switched them from conventional to sumo, they started crushing it. Let's try that. And as you build a more catalog of experience as a coach, you're more likely to be right than wrong. And that's a kind of a good probabilistic way of looking at it and thinking of it. So the final piece, and arguably the most important piece when you're designing individualized training programs, is that individual preferences piece. And so, for example, you might look at someone and be like, yeah, the sumo deadlift is going to be great for them, because I've had so many experience, people who kind of are built like that anthropometrically. I've taken the science to know that I need to have this kind of linear approach. We're going to taper. We're going to get more specific as we get close. I'm also looking at this person and I see, certain, like proportionality to their physique. I'm thinking, oh, you know what, they're strong, but they're really lacking a lot of upper body mass, which is actually quite common in junior powerlifters. They typically, they're just as strong as the open at a high level, except for their bench, which is interesting. So maybe it takes more time to develop that upper body musculature. So, okay, I see that, and I see the sumo deadlift thing. I'm going to have them do a lot of volume for their upper body, and I want to give them all this hypertrophy. But if they say, hey, I can only work out, 2 days a week, and by the way, I have a prior back injury or a prior hip injury, excuse me. Now, all of a sudden, you have to modify your decision. Like, oh, well, is a lot of sumo pulling good for someone with a hip injury? And okay, well, hold on. How do I have, 20 sets a week of bodybuilding on top of their powerlifting training if only been training twice a week? Now, all of a sudden, all that goes out the window, because just like I described in my training pyramid, the base is adherence. I think a lot of the times when people and they find what might even be a good cookie cutter program, as good as they can be, is that they'll try to apply what they feel their favorite influencer or scientist or whatever is optimal. Like someone will grab the muscle and strength pyramid. Let's say they're a big fan of me, which of course they are. No, but in all seriousness, they might misapply what I'm trying to teach them. They go, okay, hey, the advanced program, I want to be advanced. They're not advanced. Mistake number one. And that's a 6-day per week program. Awesome. They work night shifts on a rotating schedule, 5 days per week, and they're a part-time student, and they have 2 kids. Terrible idea to try to train 6 days a week. It's going to be worse than even maybe training 3 or 4 times a week. And they try to do that because it's optimal on paper. And then they just beat themselves up when they fail on it, or feel there's something wrong with the program, or get hurt, or are only able to train 4 days per week, which is actually great considering that person's schedule, but feel like they're failing all the time. So I think most importantly is you have to take all that information about the person and then filter it through their reality, their needs, their preferences, their fears, their prior injury history, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. One of the things, and this is actually an interesting conversation that just popped in my head, Andrea Valdez, who is our Chief Operations Officer at 3DMJ, she did coaching with us for a while before she moved into that operations role. And when we get our client reports on a weekly basis, they normally come with a spreadsheet, some videos of their lifts and potentially their physique, depending on what sport they're in, bodybuilding or powerlifting, or what their goals are. And we have all this objective data, and then our impression of their movement or their physique development or their progress over time. And then they also give us a subjective report, either a video report or typed out how things went. And one of the things she likes to do is she would look at just the objective data first and not read their report and go, okay, what would I do without any input from them? And then she would look at their subjective data, and then to try to not be, not that you don't want to be influenced by their subjective experience, you absolutely do, but trying to remain objective and as an observer and go, okay, here's their experience, here's what I'm seeing, here's what I would do if they were a robot, and then how do I take the most of the elements of what I would just do and then filter that through their experiences, their needs, their preferences, their emotions, and their life reality. Some of that subjective stuff is actually just a subjective report of objectivity. Like, it's not subjective that you have to pick up an extra shift on Saturday. That's just important information that's logistical. So I think that process is what that third leg of the evidence-based stool looks like. I could add a bunch of other things that might come into that. We know that on average, bands and chains are not more effective than training with just normal barbells at the group level. But is that research on people who specifically have miss their deadlifts at lockout? No. Is there a logical rationale to why overloading the top end with bands or chains of a deadlift might be helpful for someone who struggles at lockout? Potentially, you know? So I think making those kind of logical connections and betting on things that make logical sense, even though we don't have science, combining that with individual differences, and then also your collective experiences as someone at least working towards being an expert. Or if you're not, if you're a new coach, this is why there's the internet. This is why you can have mentors. You don't have to rely on the fact that all you've done is really coached your brother for free for a couple months, like last week. That doesn't make any sense. For the last couple months, for a couple months, you've coached him. If that's your only coaching experience, then yeah, you're not an expert yet. But the only way you're going to become one is by doing a lot of coaching. But that doesn't mean you can't look into getting a mentor. Go on to like for what I did, like you mentioned before we started recording, how I learned a lot from Mike Tushir. And he influenced me to actually do my PhD on RPE. I collected every post he made on a forum into a document. And I just read through it and made sure I actually understood what he was saying. And I listened to his podcasts. I followed a lot of people in my early career who I was able to identify to the best of my ability as I think these people are experts. What they say makes logical sense. It matches up with other people who I see are that way. They're not speaking in hyperbole. They're speaking probabilistically, which is something that actual experts do rather than in absolutes typically. Their confidence level scales with what I think is a reasonable level of confidence for even knowing something. I was able to differentiate someone like that from someone like, say, Charles Poliquin, who'd be like, hey, taking this supplement like this is going to give you a 6% improvement in your power clean. I'm like, how could you know that? You don't have an alternate reality machine or like the dev simulator of the world to test that with a twin, So I think that is something you can do before you develop that skill. But anyway, that was a really complex answer to how you take an evidence-based framework. You need to know the limitations of science. You need to leverage that based on what the individual can do, their situation, and then add it to your personal experiences.
Absolutely. And I think it's important actually that you do explain, why actually we need to take into all these considerations. Whenever I do a Q&A on my Instagram story and I have, my demographic is a lot of beginners and early or intermediate lifters, because of my age, I'm 22 years old and, so more people that are my age are going to relate to me and be like, okay, well, he's done this, and they find it inspiring, motivating, whatever. But whenever I answer a question, and I'll have some rants here and there just because I'm just trying to understand, help people understand who don't have a science background, who haven't gone through a university degree, who don't understand, how science works, and then, understand that the body, that we can have a lot of the science says this and theory can say this, and then my experience can say this. And those are all, valid pieces of data because they are our experiences. They have been observed in a lab or what have you. And, when I explain, when my answer is a lot of gray, it's like, well, what is your goal? Like what you said in the case of bands and chains. In the case of most raw powerlifters, if you look at like a progression towards the mean, is that as important? If you don't have a bench shirt, when you're probably going to be more challenged, in the mid range for most raw bench, for most raw lifters. Well, yeah, maybe not. But if you have an athlete that does have a specific weakness, and you notice, oh, their deadlift, they always seem to, really, really struggle at that little top half of the deadlift. Or, like what you said in the case of a junior, well, this guy actually has a lot of muscle mass on his legs. He can actually, deadlift, 700 pounds. So add 100 pounds to his lower body lifts. I can see that happening in the next year, but I can't really see that happening with the current muscle mass, at least not to the extent that the athlete wants or what I want for their long-term development. Maybe I'm going to spend a little bit more time on their upper body and maybe take some of that volume that I would have, had for the lower body, and dedicate more to upper body hypertrophy work, and maybe put, further away from competition, more maintenance volumes around, quote unquote, for my lower body to maintain the skill, the muscle mass, and the neuromuscular efficiency. And, all that stuff. So I guess then kind of just circling back, um, so obviously we kind of just described there is no one size fits all. If you are having, in our case, a late beginner, early or intermediate who is noticing, man, my gains are slowing down, but I still really want to get stronger. I want to do all the things that are necessary for me to get stronger, develop more neuromuscular efficiency, increase, have more, optimal pronation angles of the muscle relative to the adaptation of specific movement patterns, build more muscle. Would you recommend for most strength athletes, based off of your, and again, I understand we're kind of shoehorning into like a generality here, but in the case of a takeaway, do you think that somebody should focus more specific periods of their training on developing, the qualities of a specific rep range? So, for example, how I will usually program is for hypertrophy, it's going to be mainly, sets of 6 to 12 reps, less specific work. And then I'll, progressively go get more and more specific. I guess, how would you program in your rep ranges for a long period? Would you do more of a DUP? And in the case of a DUP, do more of an emphasis based off of the actual goal of that phase of training, with putting every other, aspect on the back burner? Or would you have a specific block where it is really hyper focused on developing one quality?
Great question. So there's limited data that would suggest that in trained lifters, undulating periodization is slightly better for strength development. And this is a little more clear, and I don't think this has anything to do with different body regions. It's a little more clear for the bench press, if I recall correctly, looking at some of Greg Knuckles' analysis, in addition to some of the peer-reviewed published stuff. So undulating programs, though, we have to think about why might an undulating program be better than a linear one, and and why is it for trained lifters specifically? And this sort of goes back to 2 things. One, why were undulating programs developed in the first place? And then 2, it goes to what is unique about trained lifters compared to novice lifters, kind of going back to that regression to the mean. So in novice lifters, periodization in general doesn't seem to be as effective for trained lifters because so much works. And the definition that is typically used in the literature for what is periodization is that there is some change in the rep range. So a non-periodized program would still be progressive typically. What they might have is they'll give someone a 8 to 12 RM load that they will use, and anytime with the current load they're using, they can get more than 12 reps to kick the load up next time. So they try to keep them in the same rep range, but progressive and probably training to failure, because that's what they do in science to standardize things. But the whole training block. So it's progressive in nature, and the loading range doesn't change. The number of sets doesn't change. The rest period doesn't change. The exercise selection doesn't change. All that stuff is static. The comparative periodized one in a linear program, it might move from 12 to 15 all the way down to 4 to 6. And if you wanted to have a volume match comparison, you'd have 8 to 12 versus that, but it would be the same net volume, the same average load, but one would be linear, and it would get you more specificity towards the end. So undulating just means that either week to week in a weekly undulating format, or as you said, a daily undulating periodization format, on different days of the week, you have different targets. Typically, though, a daily undulating programming strategy is still linear. So, for example, if you were to compare a linear to a DUP program, that DUP program, it might start out at 15, 10, 8 as the 3 different undulations earlier in this let's say 12-week program. Later and towards the end, it might be 8, 6, 4, or even 6, 4, 2 as the undulation pattern, right? Now, that kind of clarifies the difference between an undulating versus a linear one. There's these distinct blocks, if you will, or block periodization is kind of a truncated version of linear. And they're still linear. Both are linear. I think that's an important thing to remember. They get more specific over time. The reason why undulating periodization was originally developed is to deal with the decay of specific adaptations. So ironically, I took a shot at Charles Poliquin rest in peace, earlier. But back in the late 80s, he was the one who proposed the idea of undulating periodization. And this is an extremely important contribution to the literature. And there was a time when Charles Poliquin had much better advice than in the later portion of his career. So to give credit where it's due, he developed the idea of undulating periodization to deal with the traditional linear pattern of spending like a whole block at very high reps, and then for traditional sports, not necessarily powerlifting, moving from 20s to 10s to 5s, you're going to see a loss of some of that work capacity, a loss of that muscular endurance, a loss of some of that strength endurance set to set, and you might even see some loss of hypertrophy as you go down just those 5s. You could make an argument theoretically that if you want to peak overall fitness or specific performance that might have to do with multiple components like strength, you would want to not lose some of those other qualities, right? You don't want to have your workload capacity become insufficient to train optimally for strength. You don't want to have some loss of muscle mass, as that potentially would lower the ceiling on your strength. So undulation just means that you do a little bit of the prior or next adaptation that's coming to taper or smooth out those connections while you still have an overall phase. Like, comparing an undulation pattern of 15, 12, 10, it's still quite different than 6, 4, 2. And you wouldn't put those next to each other. You'd probably bridge them with something like 4, 6, 8, and then 6, 8, 12, right? So that is kind of a good, fair, charitable version of undulating periodization. As I mentioned before, undulating, like that's not one program. It's there's many iterations of it. You could take a really shitty version of undulating programming and making it, be unsuccessful. You can also have a block model with undulations within it. So you could have, an accumulation block, which can take from block periodization, and all of your undulations are double digits, from the 10 to 20 rep range if you want. Then you can have an intensification phase, right? Where now your undulations are still there, but they're undulating in a more low rep range. You might be anywhere from, 2 to 8 or something like that. And doing that would make the contrast between the two a little more smoothed out, and would reduce any, theoretically, loss of some of the work capacity and muscular hypertrophy that you got from the first block, while focusing on strength. So the reason why it may work better for experienced or non-novices is that a novice who does a strength program is going to gain strength, hypertrophy, muscular endurance, and general fitness, because all of those qualities are already quite low. And doing something is always going to produce overload compared to nothing. If you take an advanced lifter and you put them on a program that's all 3 to 6s, and they've, let's say they're quote unquote peaked at the moment, they'll probably lose size while doing resistance training, right? Mind blown. But it's because what they were doing previously to reach a advanced level peak in hypertrophy was a lot, Take your average high-level natural bodybuilder and you put them on a peaking block for powerlifting, they're going to lose some size, despite that they're training very hard with weights. So I think that kind of nuance is important to understand why different periodization models might be better for more advanced lifters. And I think block, undulating, and some of the other models that are out there that came after the initial periodization literature and experiments and back from the 60s, all of them have tried to deal with the issue of different competition schedules for different sports, and also the loss of prior adaptations. So I think the take home here is not you should be doing undulating periodization if you're an advanced lifter, but rather you should be doing something to make sure that if you spent a period of time building workload capacity and hypertrophy, that you can hold on to most of it as you move towards a peak and you try to compete. So if you're doing something which I don't think most people would do, where you're training completely in the 6 to 15 rep range, and then you just started doing singles for 4 weeks, that probably wouldn't be a good idea. It doesn't take much to hold on to your muscle size, and there's only so much deliberate practice you can get that benefits strength directly. I would guess that if we took advanced lifters and we had them squat to a max 6 days a week versus 4 days a week, there wouldn't be much of a difference, because you're already getting so much practice. There's only so much you can do. There's only so much you can leverage specificity. You're going to hit that ceiling. So why not reduce some of that and spend more time just doing whatever maintenance qualities are needed for the other adaptations you've got. Um, as a practical example with my own lifting career, when I'm not competing in bodybuilding, which is most of my time, because who wants to always be starving to death, is I'm competing in Olympic weightlifting, powerlifting, and dabbling in strongman. So I'm very interested in the question of, at my various skill level in each one of those strength sports, what is the minimum amount I can to make progress and the minimum amount I can to not decay? Because then when I focus on another one, I can put much more effort into it. And so I periodize based on kind of that process, which encapsulates some of the questions you're asking. So overall, to get to what I'm saying, if you're taking an intermediate lifter who is wanting to optimize things, move to the next level, I think you need to be concerned both about non-specific and specific work. You need to be doing training at times that is optimized towards building muscle mass. And then you need to make sure you're not losing it while you go through training periods that are highly specific. I like to use singles, for example, in an increasing frequency and an increasing RPE, or intensity, or proximity to failure, if you will, as I get closer to a competition, because it's more specific to what you're going to do on game day, which is 9 lifts that are at a 7.5 RPE or higher for singles, right? And well, hopefully none of them are at 11 RPE. Hopefully you don't miss any lifts, right? However, just like you don't want to lose the hypertrophy adaptations from a higher hypertrophy block, you also don't want to go into an intensity block and feel like, oh my God, this feels like 1,000,000 pounds on my back, even though it's just like a 6 RM load, right? So you don't want moderately heavy triples to feel like death on your back, because that's going to be some lost time as you undershoot the load and you just acclimate to having heavy load on your back. So for example, I might have someone work up to a single at a 6 or 7 RPE in an accumulation block. They're primarily doing non-specific work, bodybuilding, and doing like touch and go bench, touch and go deadlifts. They might be doing high bar squats instead of low bar, for example, and then doing a lot of accessory work. And their RPEs are in like the 5 to 8 range, and their reps are in the 4 to 8 rep range on the main lifts, and higher than that on the secondary lifts. But they might start with doing a single at a 6 or a single at a 7 on the comp squat, comp bench, or comp deadlift at least once per week, because they maintain that skill. And really, how hard is working up to a single at a 6 on one of the big 3? It's not much of a time cost. It's not much of a recovery factor. And for an intermediate, there's only so much you can do that will be beneficial. So why not invest, that extra 10 minutes to start things off, and then move into your back off work after that. And then conversely, the next phase I move into, we'll see more singles at a higher RPE and less back off work, or low reps on that back off work, or less accessory work. So kind of the throughput becomes more specific as they move closer and closer to competition.
I really agree with a lot of what you said there. And actually, from my own practical experience, earlier on in this block, about 3 weeks ago, I went off program. And my coach gave me crap for it, but I was like, obviously it's a stupid idea. It's because I follow a block periodized model. That's how my coach does it. I did nothing below really 6 reps. And I decided it would be a good idea to like just do a single at like RPE like 9-ish or like 10. And surprisingly, when I hit 650 on my deadlift in competition, the 585 felt just as hard. And I think that what you just said about the whole utility of, I guess, an undulating model and keeping some aspects of each quality for the later stage load lifters, I think that is important. I think that for myself in practical experience, what I've noticed with a lot of my athletes is that once they do go from, let's say if they're doing specifically, so I am 100%, I don't have my ego way up in the clouds where I can say, I know everything. I'm freaking 22. I just graduated with my bachelor's degree. I've only been lifting for 3.5 years. And so I'm willing to experiment and see what works best for me and what works well with the trends. And I will play an anecdote to the fact that I do think that if you do take time completely off, there are certain periods where it is appropriate, where maybe you might not have somebody who's right after a meet even do a single, because the idea of doing a single gives them PTSD. But it's keeping some quality in a general preparatory period, such as in hypertrophy. Maybe you just do a slight single to maintain that neuromuscular efficiencies that you are so used to doing a slightly higher load than 75% of your max. So then once you move into a more specific strength block and then a peaking block, you can still, have there's less of a lag time, I guess. And losing time in productive training is very, like, that's meaningful. Like, even if it's like in 1 week of acclimation or 2 weeks of a transition block, that's still time that could have been quote unquote wasted through productive overload training. It's why deloading and whatnot, I always will schedule in my deloads, and I think, probably at this point they're going to need it. But I also rely on their feedback, their subjective feedback, and how are they feeling? Are they still able to progress? And then maybe I'll extend it, or if they're feeling really beat up because they had a crazy life stress, and we didn't know, we'll deload early. So I think that my main takeaway from that is that if you are a competitive athlete who is interested as a power lifter in developing all the qualities of powerlifting, being able to still have a productive off season, the power lifter off season, where you're putting on some tissue and, focusing on higher reps, still incorporating some sport specific work is important.
I think that's a good takeaway, man. And there's also some other little side benefits. So I like the way you said, like, lost training time or lost training time at a peak, or at least a good level. I'll use that kind of subjective determination does matter, because we're talking about a meet prep. Let's say you did have a really non-specific block of training where you don't do any singles, or you haven't touched anything RM load. And like you said, maybe you can deadlift 650, but 585 feels like 650 now. Let's say you could go and you start that single and you do 585 and like, oh my God, that's heavy. Not only is that going to create some psychological fear, oh my God, in 8 weeks, I'm going to try to deadlift more than 650, and 585 was a 9.5. That means next week, what's the most you're going to try? 600, So how much time do you have? Because you're always using the prior strength as your reference point to build from. Even in an auto-regulated model, you're still, you're aware, you have knowledge of your previous performance. You're only going to reach so far. You're not going to be like, maybe that was a bad day, let me go for 640 today. You're probably not going to make a 65 kilo jump, from session to session. I don't think you should, So if you keep in those reasonable, moderate singles, it bridges that better. So when you in that accumulation block, that 585 that felt like a 9.5, maybe feels like a 7, and you're like, hey, I'm good to go 610 next time, and that'll be an 8. And you'll build that confidence. You'll be where you think you are. Maybe you wouldn't even hit 585. Maybe you would have done 600. So it gives you less time where you are not confident in your abilities and not able to make those progressive jumps towards that peak. And additionally, those singles at even a moderate RPE, that's still like 85% of your 1RM at the lowest, a single to 5, single to 6. And that basically gives you a diagnostic tool. I don't expect your strength to be going up during an accumulation block. I expect fatigue to be a little higher. I expect muscle damage to be higher. And I expect your strength maybe to be, your top end to be decaying a little bit because of non-specific training. But how much is it decaying? That's something I want to know. If all of a sudden what I think should be a 6 RPE jumps all the way up to an 8, maybe I am not building enough qualities or maintaining enough maintenance work on your top end strength while I build muscle mass. We need to be doing slightly more sets of the big 3, a little more specific work. It tells me better about, is the maintenance dose I'm giving you actual maintenance? Like, I expect it to be suppressed, that's why, a taper and a whole comp process might put 2 or 3% on your lift on game day, even from an intensity block. So I kind of extrapolate that back all the way to the accumulation block. I expect you to be 5% down, right? But if you're 10% down, if you're 15% down, does that tell me there's something wrong with this accumulation block? Is it going to be a real tough bridge to your intensity block? I can't know that if we're only doing, touch and go, close grip bench with your feet up. Like, that's going to be different enough to your comp bench for me to dismiss any kind of low load performance that cock my eyebrow. My eyebrow probably won't cock, And I think you could say the same thing for like a front squat, or if you normally pull sumo doing conventional or an RDL. If you're not touching anything near the loads or the movement pattern that you're actually be competing with, you don't really know if you're building some of those capacities that are going to translate well. It might be too much of a diversion before you have to become more specific, and you're making up lost ground that you didn't necessarily have to lose if you'd just done some more of that specific work to maintain that specificity.
Yeah, and I also think another utility of it in the case of like, you point out, oh, I'm just doing like an 85% single during my, during my hypertrophy based undulation, even though you may still be doing the undulating model where you do have multiple rep ranges. Not only that, when you do go into an undulating where it's more strength, that 85%, that could be a solid, RPE 8, set of 4, and you're not going to waste as much time, I guess, getting more used to having a heavier, percentage of your 1 rep max, your theoretical 1 rep max, because it changes based on fatigue, and that's why RPE is a thing. But I guess like what you said, it kind of just makes the whole training transition times less lag and more productive training. So I think that's all really, really awesome stuff. So I wanted to just, I guess, now pivot a little bit on into something that I've been wondering myself is, we have this big debate going on right now in our current the current evidence-based practice about, I guess, the volume. And obviously I'm sure you're sick and tired of hearing about volume. My question is different than I think what lots of people have been asking. And my question is, should we even be concerned about a maximum recoverable volume or minimum effective volume and kind of be chasing that? Or should we just be chasing what we know we can consistently recover and adapt from? Because I think that there's a lot of confusion based off of people chasing the grass is always greener, because of some studies that have said, oh, if I do more volume and if I can recover from it, I get more gains. Sweet. Okay, so let's add on three sets. Well, maybe you were doing 12 sets and you're recovering just fine. That's still a big increase. That's 25% increase of what you were doing before, and that's a lot, and that could take up so much of your recovery capacity that you're not able to actually recover and adapt. And I think this has application to both bodybuilding and powerlifting programming. So when you are programming for somebody, I guess, how concerned should we even be about knowing the bottom end and the top end, and should we just seek for finding a spot where we know that we can do well and actually, consistently progress from? Because I think that there's a lot of people that have seen success with both approaches, obviously evidence-based, blah, 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 blah. But my question is, are we overcomplicating the training process too much? And should we be more seeking a happy medium, I guess, where we know we can see progress instead of guessing? Because I think a lot of the biggest problems and limitations with the maximum recoverable volume, especially, is you're just guessing. You're just throwing darts at a dartboard, hoping that one sticks. And this isn't meant to be, a call of anybody. This is just meant to be a respectful, intellectual conversation about what are we just kind of having this too much of an ADHD approach with volume?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that anytime we decide to onboard additional complexity, we should be very sure that it is worth it. So I also think that anytime we are bootstrapping landmarks as proxies for performance or places to go with training variables in general, they need to have a support from an underlying validity perspective. I don't dispute the existence of maximum recoverable volume. I think it's probably more useful to talk about it as total training stress, because when we call it maximum recoverable volume, it seems to imply that volume is the primary thing we can't recover from. When, if you were to talk to Mike Israetel, he'll readily acknowledge that maximum recoverable volume changes. If you do a lower volume, it's lower because you're not adapted to as much. So it'll come down to meet you, or you can push it up by doing more and then hit your own ceiling. You'll also acknowledge that it changes when you're in a deficit, doing cardio, stressed, not sleeping as much. So it's clearly not, you can pay attention to the volume aspect to figure out what's the most you can do, but it's truly the overall allostatic load and training stress that is your threshold, and that changes. And while I think he would disagree with you that you are just guessing when you're trying to determine your minimum effective volume and your maximum recoverable volume, I think this goes back to that whole baseline validity. No one has studied or established what is the reliability of someone's maximum recoverable volume. No one's done a study where they've taken a bunch of, say, intermediates and then given them homogeneous loads, rest periods, nutrition, and controlled as many variables as possible, and then just simply started playing with different volumes, and then repeated that process to see if they lost strength at the same volume. And saw, we don't know how labile or variable that point is where you start to lose strength. And I am definitely not convinced that volume is the biggest player there. I could see other life stresses being a player there. I could see, probably not, but potentially intensity being a player there. Proximity to failure, I think, would definitely be a player there. So I don't necessarily think that all of a sudden we should be bootstrapping or using landmarks based on something that aren't firm. What I would agree is firm, but probably means you're not doing as much, that you have to wait longer to pay attention, is performance. So as a power lifter, everything you do should be resulting in you getting stronger over time, over what can be reasonably guessed to be appropriate for your training age. And that has some subjectivity to it. You have to have some delayed elements of gratification. I think you were speaking to the grass is always greener, which is kind of a conditionally problematic perspective for lifters. A novice who has a grass is always greener perspective, by program hopping within the realm of rationally good programs and not doing it like every 3 weeks. Like if you can actually make it through a mesocycle and you switch to a different program and they're within the realm of reasonable, like if this is someone who's listening to me and Mike Israetel debate, they're probably not doing like totally crap programs. So not a huge issue, if the grass is always greener, because you're probably not going to land on something that's not going to allow you to progress. And you might experiment enough to figure out what works well for you. However, the grass is always greener mentality for an intermediate or advanced person, I think, is more likely to lead you towards stagnation than anything. And you'll find this out pretty quick, because making progress at all as an intermediate or advanced lifter is difficult. The question when you're working with high-level athletes is not what will get you optimal progress, despite people saying that, despite that's what they want. For an advanced lifter, especially drug-free athletes, when I work with them, I am hoping to make progress, period. Because you can see lifters who go through years of time and they're at a high level. So it's not surprising where they can't progress, So, when you talk to natural bodybuilders who are trying to get their stage weight to go up 2 or 3 pounds, or when you're trying to get a power lifter to go from a 700 to a 705 total, that's a less than 1% change on their total. So I think people need to be aware that if you have currently landed on something which is producing measurable progress as an intermediate or an advanced lifter, and you're deciding, something might be better out there, or maybe I could be doing more, that is potentially a problem, because you're already doing more than enough and more than most things right if you're getting that progress. And I would say that the literature is biased towards novices, lesser trained individuals, If you've ever worked in a lab and trained people, they will typically tell you, especially in a traditional training study where you push to failure, which a lot of the volume literature is, that's the hardest I've ever trained when they look at an individual training session. They're not used to being pushed by a whole bunch of lab personnel. They're not used to having an automatic progression in load every week. The percentages rise. They're not used to being on a really structured program. So we're looking at people who are increasing not only their quantity of work, but also their quality, and are also having a whole lot of accountability they didn't previously have, a whole lot of motivation, and potentially having other factors controlled and provided, like being given post-workout whey protein as a thank you for coming into the study, making sure they're eating at least 1.6 grams per kg per day, having a dietitian go over with you multiple time points, hey, what is your eating habits? Let's try to replicate this. So while studies are cookie cutter programs, and sometimes people will poo-poo the training protocols in studies, most people are already doing a cookie cutter program. They're just doing it with less motivation, less accountability, less effort, and they're probably missing some sessions when they have to be in the lab on Monday, Wednesday, Friday with a team of people trying to get the most out of them within the confines of that program. So I think we need to be aware if that population is not representative of you. You know, if you're a USAPL nationally qualified powerlifter and you feel like, oh, that makes me an intermediate, which is actually crazy. You're an intermediate elite powerlifter, you know, like, but you're not an actual intermediate. And you're reading a study on people who can squat 1.5 times body weight. You know, I'm talking to you, you can deadlift 650 pounds. You would probably be among the 0.001% strongest people to ever appear in the scientific literature. Your mentality is thus probably different from those people. So when you read a study where these quote unquote trained lifters, and they are trained, I don't want to, you know, like poo-poo them or anything like that. If they increase their volume and they got faster gains, is that going to apply to me? And if I'm already making gains, isn't that something that I should be pretty protective of? So in general, I think you don't want to think like a gambler. You want to think like an investor. You know, what is the opportunity cost? What is the potential loss I could have? As a novice, moving to a new program from one that's working, so long as you actually complete it, you train hard and all that stuff, you're probably going to make very similar gains unless you jump to something really stupid. As an intermediate and you're making really good gains, jumping to something else, I don't have stats to back this up, but I would think there's probably a higher chance of you making worse progress.
I can speak from from anecdote. I've done the cyclical volume, and I've seen great gains from it. I've done static. I've seen great gains from it too. Um, I think that you and I will definitely agree here with progress is progress. And if you're progressing well, and if it's consistently, and as you have a less heterogeneity and more homogeneity with your training variables, and you can predict your own response better, that just means more consistent, more measurable progress, because the more moving variables that you have changing, because life is already complex enough, you know, maybe you only got 6 hours of sleep last night. Maybe that made your RPE go up, like, you know, literally like by 1 point. So instead of having this, oh, well, last week I did 330 on squat for eights. Okay, well, if my actual, you know, from RPE target at the same RPE, unfortunately, I can't go up, you know, what I wanted to do, and maybe I have to go down even. You know, it's stuff like that. And if you're increasing sets or whatnot, just across, just because you think that you should, or maybe because that's better. Well, why did that really happen? Was it because you missed a meal yesterday? Was it because you're dieting? Is it because you added a set needlessly? And I think there's certainly times when it is appropriate, like, you know, you're trying to functionally overreach for a meet, but, you know, before you taper to get that small increase in performance on meet day, then yeah, you should probably definitely push it and above what you're normally doing. But I also think it's important to have that baseline of where can I progress, I guess, quote unquote, at all. You know, like we said, the search for optimal is kind of futile, because it kind of does change from person to person. You're not the same. You might find, I think that this is why, as coaches and as evidence-based practitioners, you frame this at the beginning, when you're, you know, we're discussing just a basic client, you know, what worked well for you, what didn't work well for you with this. what do you think that you can improve? Or, like just knowing like their personality, that gives a lot of insight into how much of a response, or how much of a dose does this person need? I know from, like I've had people ask me like something as trivial as like, what's my muscle fiber type? And I'm like, well, it's like, I'm tempted to like go into like well, it's really like 55, 45, like how do I know it? I'm like, one, like, why does that matter that much? Because you kind of just know that through experience, because, the type 2 muscle fiber more dominant power lifters that are very, very, very good, you have guys like Yuri Belkan, who are so strong and are so fast twitch, they can't, they deadlift once every 2 weeks because that fatigue is so great for them. Whereas if I was to tell somebody who was, or like, in the non-responder studies, for example, they're so slow twitch, they need that so much higher volume. So I think that what you said about just seeking, if, especially as a beginner, or, as an intermediate or an advanced, because as a beginner, you can kind of just do whatever, and you'll grow because your baseline is so low. When you go up and your baseline is increasing as you get more training experience, making any sort of measurable progress over the long term is meaningful. And I think that sometimes the comparison, especially in the social media day and age, where we are constantly seen with the top 1% or less than that, and we think we need to be better. So therefore, there's something wrong with our training protocol. And if you're making good progress, and if it's measurable, and if you can see a linearity of, obviously there's going to be pulsatility across microcycles and whatever, but macrocycle to macrocycle, you're improving, and it's at a good rate for where you think that you probably should be. You probably don't need to change that much, and maybe more of a reactionary approach is better. And like what you said, measuring performance is a little bit more difficult to actually quantify because a lot of things do play into it. Sometimes that's just the best approach, and that's just how training goes, because I think it kind of will, and again, I'm saying I think here, but I think it will kind of balance out either way that you do it with a pulsatile volume where you're kind of going up and then going down. Eventually, we know as adaptive beings adapt, it becomes harder and harder and harder to adapt. So once you kind of are you're telling, I'm not really adapting that much from a 5x5 anymore, or whatever. Maybe I'm going to add in 6 sets of 5 on this squat workout, and then you will measure the data and be like, okay, well, this is probably good. So I know I'm kind of rambling a little bit, but I guess my main takeaway from that, and again, we need more, we need more research essentially, but I think if you're needlessly changing things, it kind of just, it's needless, and it kind of leads to a lot of tail spinning and no validity, and or I guess not as much reliability, because I think reliability is so important with your training. And as a bodybuilder, when you're peaking for a show, like you said that over experience, you peak differently than your athletes, and getting that reliable response is more important. And experimentation is, and that will require some experimentation. And I think people are scared of having to experiment, but I think that's why exercise science is so cool too. But just being willing to, I guess, trust your intuition and don't make changes needlessly unless there's a real need.
I agree. Don't make needless changes unless you need to make changes. I like it. Solid ending. No, seriously, though, I think I don't disagree with any of that. I think just to steelman the approach of adding sets microcycle to microcycle, you can absolutely do that operating with your, probably what you've observed is appropriate volume for you as kind of the midpoint of that cycle. So you start below it, you go higher than it, and such that the changes week to week are small, like adding one set. Like if you had a 6-week mesocycle, and that you can handle somewhere between 12 to 14, you can go 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, and I'm not even sure that was 6, but you get my point, is you can kind of cross that average in the middle of the block, start below it, and then track strength performance over time, and you would be able to see what was the average set volume that you did that seemed to be related to when you were or weren't progressing, and you can work from there. So you can also use increases or decreases in sets in the same way that I described the utility of a block or undulating pattern as a way to bridge between different types of training. So if you were to, as an example, go from an accumulation block to an intensity block, but you weren't going to compete, and you wanted to go back to an accumulation block, what would you do to get from a lower volume, higher intensity approach to a higher volume, higher rep approach? You would probably need to do like an intro week. So you might take a couple of microcycles to up your set volume. Likewise, the deload at the end of an accumulation block effectively works as a taper down into the set volume you're going to use in that intensity block if it's lower. And during that deload, you can make it a little more like an intensification deload. You can drop your sets and increase your load slightly. If you were using predominantly the 10 to 15 rep range, that deload could be like 8s, and then you can move into that intensification block with better ability to handle those loads. So it's not to say that you should never increase sets week to week, but the magnitude of it, the reference point of knowing what you can handle, and the utility of it as a way to bridge so you don't lose prior adaptations. Now that all meets some of the principles that we already have established with periodization and makes logical sense. But the idea that you need to push all the way up to the most volume you can handle before seeing strength loss within a mesocycle, I think that's probably the only area that I would caution against doing, because I don't think it's necessary and might potentially be worse.
Sure. Just going off of that last little tidbit is, I think that what you pointed out there is around an average of what you best respond to. And again, if you're always changing, you might not know what that average is, and so you might not know, am I needs to overcomplicating this? And then obviously, you can do that approach as a way to I could also improve adherence. If somebody's like, oh, I'm going to 12 to 16 sets per week on this muscle group, and then I drop back down, and then for like I do like 8 sets for my deload, so that's half of it, and then I resume the process. That can also help with adherence for something that's a difficult time backing off when they have to, especially before they're actually like just beat to shit, for lack of a better term. Because powerlifting and bodybuilding, we love to push, and that's kind of part of why the masochistic love of the iron. So I think I wanted to just leave it off there. I think that's a lot for the listeners to unpack and take away. So I wanted to thank you so much for being willing to come on. I really appreciate it. And those of you guys who do not know who Eric Helms is, obviously you just listened to this, go follow him. Eric, where can they follow you? And a little bit more about you, and get coached by the man himself.
Absolutely. So yeah, first off, just thanks for having me on, for sure. And I really appreciate the discussion. I hope it was helpful to everyone listening. And I can't guarantee you can be coached by me, because I'm actually not taking on any new clients. However, the team that I am the chief scientific officer for, yes, that is a throwback to Star Trek, is 3D Muscle Journey. So we provide sustainable performance support from an evidence-based perspective for the drug-free lifting community. We work primarily with bodybuilders and some powerlifters as well. You can check us out at 3dmusclejourney.com. That's the number 3, the letter D, then musclejourney.com. And then if you want to follow me more closely, I post multiple times per week on Instagram at Helms3DMJ. You can find links to podcasts I do, like this one, other appearances, articles, blogs, etc. And I've got links to all the other good stuff. But you can find links to my books, my research review that I do with the rest of the MASS crew, and the 3DMJ Vault, where we have our courses all at 3dmusclejourney.com. And also you can check out my podcast, Omar Isuf, Iron Culture, where we talk about all this and more.
Yeah, so I would definitely vouch for a MASS research review. I am subscribed to it, and just there's a ton of really good value. And if you guys want to stay up to date, it's the most easily digestible form of research review you can possibly have, and it has, you know, it's not boring to read. Unlike having to sort through all these studies, and you know, you have Dr. Helms, who is a weirdo and likes doing that stuff for us. But anyways, I wanted to again thank you for coming on, and to all the listeners, thank you for listening, and talk to you next time. Bye.